top 7 reasons of why an ERP implementation fails globally. Hi all, my name is Raman and I am from ERP Doctor. From my experience of working with more than 200 plus companies globally in implementing an ERP software, these are the top 7 reasons of why an ERP implementation fails. Reason number 1 is scope creep. What is a scope creep? When you start an ERP implementation project, there is a defined requirement that you want to get done from an ERP application. And as time passes by, if you start changing the requirements again and again, now this leads to a detrimental effect. Budget-wise, you start facing issues. Time-wise, you start facing issues. And the vendor or the implementation partner is not able to deliver your requirement. And what happens is, you basically lose track of what is the core requirement and find yourself spread out at a lot of places. Scope creep is one key reason why ERP implementations fail globally. Now, how do we overcome this particular problem? When it comes to ERP implementation, you will have to identify your scope very clearly and have them prioritized. Not all your requirements have to be a priority. Please make sure that whatever modules or whatever features and functions are of top priority to you are prioritized, listed, and given to the vendor as top priority scope that has to be achieved no matter what happens. Make sure that you go behind the scope and follow it and get it done. If there is a strong requirement of adding additional scope which cannot be avoided, make sure that you keep it to as much minimal as possible. Whenever you get any additional scope, it is very practical that during the course of ERP implementation, there might be scopes which would keep on getting added. It is wise advice that you list all those scopes, keep it aside, and make sure that you bundle them up by various modules or functionalities and have them also prioritized so that once the key scope or once the core scope is implemented, then these additional scopes are added on top of it. By doing this, you should be able to control the initial scope that you had in your mind, and as and when the implementation is completed, you can always add the additional scope on top of it and get it done smoothly. The second reason is complex customizations. Now, customizations are sometimes very critical because the off-the-shelf ERP product might not suit your requirements, but you will have to keep in your mind that the more you customize, the ERP application becomes very complex and it becomes very difficult to maintain. It is a good idea to make sure that before you buy your ERP solution, you make sure that you have at least a 60% fit so that the need for customization is as much minimal as possible. You're always better if you use the ERP solution as it is provided by the solution provider. Excessive customization not only makes the ERP solution complex, but also increases your dependency on the solution provider or on the implementation partner. And so what happens is, if there's any eventuality involved in the relationship, then you get stuck with one implementation partner, or you never are able to come out of that implementation partner. So, summarizing what I said right now, try to adhere to the standard features and functionalities which are provided in the ERP solution. If you have to customize, make sure that the customization is kept as much minimal as possible, and make sure that the documentation required for the customization or the source code for the customization is taken and documented properly so that in case of any eventuality, you can always give the documentation and the source code to a new implementation partner and not face any hassles. The third reason is user resistance or involvement. Now, an application like ERP has to be used by a lot of people in a company who is called as an user, an ERP application user. Now, it is very essential that the user basically buys in to the concept of ERP. If it doesn't happen, then he has to either be counseled or sometimes there might be force required to make sure that the buy-in is happened. If there's no buy-in from the user or if there's no involvement from the user, then definitely an ERP implementation fails. Now, user involvement or user buy-in basically fails because of certain reasons, like users might feel threatened that their job is being taken by an ERP, or they feel as if their flexibility is being lost, or they might feel that the work that they are doing is much superior than what an ERP can do. So these are some reasons why an user might not have a buy-in. So this needs to be properly counseled, where the user has to be called in and told, look, the ERP implementation or an application like ERP basically reduces your work, and make sure that you add value to the process, and the bookkeeping and the monotonous clerical work is actually handed over to the ERP. Sometimes when the resistance from the user is to make sure that transparency is compromised, then ERP has to be forced down on them. Preparing the employees or preparing the users for ERP implementation is very crucial, and it should not be taken lightly. The larger the organization gets and the complex the business becomes, it becomes very imperative for the management to make sure that the user buy-in happens early on during the ERP implementation. The fourth point is lack of support from stakeholders or executive management. Now, as the user involvement is key, similar is that the executive management's involvement or the stakeholders' involvement is also key. Now, an application like ERP is going to be used throughout the company. In such a case, it is very essential that an executive management or the top management gets involved in it. It doesn't mean that they have to be on the ground and do everything by themselves, but there needs to be clear-cut meetings where updates are provided to the executive management. The dashboard and report requirements are clearly spelled out by the executive management. And whenever there are any user resistance or issues, then those needs to be sorted out by the executive management. These are some of the points that the executive management has to take care when an ERP is implemented. They cannot afford to stay away from an ERP implementation. A very involved executive management or participative executive management makes sure that the implementation happens successfully. Point number 5, inadequate change management. An application like ERP definitely calls in for a lot of changes organizationally as well as culturally. Now, there might be some disturbances in the organizational structure. Sometimes what happens is you might be running a business process for ages together in a certain way. Now, the ERP application might call for changes in those processes. So, there might be resistance to change. So, it is very essential that the implementation partner, along with the executive management team and the user, sit down and understand what are all the changes that are required organization-wise, and to make sure that those changes are well suited to the ERP requirements. Failing to manage these changes effectively might have detrimental effect on the ERP implementation. The sixth reason is poor data quality or migration. Now, there's a very simple terminology in ERP called as garbage in, garbage out. So, the quality of data that is provided in implementing ERP should be accurate, flawless, and should avoid all the garbages. Now, the way to get quality data is your legacy system or your old system might have a lot of data over a period of time. So you would have keyed them over a period of time and they might have built up. There might be data which is not required. In most of the ERP implementations, when you take in legacy data, 40% of the data that's considered for migration has a lot of trash in it. So it is always better that you filter the data and give whatever is appropriate and needed in the future ERP implementation. Leave behind the trash or leave behind data which is not certain, and you can always create the data once the new ERP is up and running. A lot of ERP implementations, even though having a good executive management participation or a user buy-in, desperately fail because the data is poor or data with error or wrong data is provided. So this point becomes pretty critical to be taken care during an ERP implementation. One more tip for quality of data or for a successful data migration is start working on collecting the data and cleansing the data well upfront. You don't have to wait for the ERP vendor to tell you, give us this data on a particular date. So you can start working on the data well upfront. The last and the seventh point is poor vendor selection or poor selection of implementation partner. Now that you have selected a good ERP application, software-wise, you have good buy-in from your user, the executive management is pretty supportive, you have worked on your data migration and the data quality, it is very critical that you choose the right vendor who is going to do the implementation work for you. How do you select a good ERP partner or a vendor? There are simple tips. Ask the vendor to give some customer success stories which can be related to your business. Talk to those customers on how good is the vendor in implementing an ERP application, and once implemented, how good is he in supporting you. Ask for all the implementations that the ERP vendor has done and see if there's a majority implementation done based on your industry vertical. Look at the resources that are available at the ERP implementation partner's payroll, because it is also a good idea to get some of the CVs of the people who are going to work for your project and make sure that you have a one-on-one interview with them in trying to understand what kind of capabilities they have. Now, these are some simple tips of how you can choose the best vendor and the people representing the vendor. Now, addressing all these 7 reasons, there are very less chances of why an ERP implementation will fail. Now, these are 7 reasons. If taken care properly, there are very, very high chances that the ERP implementation will be successful. Thanks. Hope this video gives you enough light of what are the 7 reasons that needs to be taken care to ensure that an ERP implementation does not fail. See you in one more video on ERP from ERP Doctor. Thanks once again.